So, Starbucks had an incident a while back where there were two black homeless men, or at least two black men who looked and smelled like they were homeless. They went to a Starbucks, they sat there for hours without buying anything, and, as per company policy, they were kicked out. And of course, the usual suspects came in and said, racism, and we've seen the song and dance so many times before, you know how this plays out. Now, a sane company would say, we need to be more prompt in kicking the bums out of our store. Why were these guys hanging around for as many hours as they were hanging out? We need to do a better job of excluding shitty people. They should have been spotted within a minute, booted out. That's what a sane company would do, but not Starbucks. See, Starbucks is the vanguard of clown world, and as such, they have decided that the real problem here is their own intolerance to stinky bums loitering in their stores. But it gets better. Starbucks has decided that this is really a race problem because the stinky bums who came in and didn't buy anything and sat around for hours, they were black. And so Starbucks has decided to shut down 8,000 of their stores to educate white people about their racism because the bums that were thrown out happened to be black. And that's racism. Application of company policy to blacks is racism. This ridiculous decision by Starbucks has been lampooned from all sides. Not even the shit libs are supporting them. Everyone thinks this is dumb. And this is a very key point here. The owners of Starbucks have decided to burn a lot of cash and a lot of goodwill from the public for this cause. Not only to lose the money from closing the stores, which I think was about $16 million, but also losing money from the bad will they have created from this decision and doubling down on that bad will. And on top of that, they have decided, or at least were planning on deciding, to open their stores to the public. I think they're in the process of reversing that decision now. I'm not sure. But there was a point where they were going to decide that you could go into a Starbucks bathroom or you could sit around in a chair in Starbucks for as long as you wanted without buying anything. Shutting down the stores for a day alone cost them something around $16 million. And they know they're going to lose hundreds of millions over time in lost revenue by the bad will and people not wanting to go to a bum hangout. And this is key. This is like when Star Wars, when they cast a black lead and had this female feminist Jedi who could do everything because girl power and, taught Han Solo how to fly the Millennium Falcon. The producers knew that these decisions were going to cost them some money in the US, but they really knew it was going to cost them a lot of money in China because China's a lot less pause than the US. In fact, they severely limited their advertising in China and didn't open in a whole lot of theaters in China because they knew they weren't going to make a lot of money in China because of the decisions that they had made a conscious decision to do in their story. Of course, you could say they still made a ton of money because it's Star Wars. And because they have a monopoly on Star Wars, that they are the only ones who can do Star Wars legally because they have a legal monopoly on the Star Wars canon, they can get away with BS because they have that monopoly power. But instead of building excitement for each new installment, revenues of the series are dropping because they cashed in on the Star Wars name and got that initial excitement, but it can only decline now because there's no substance or plausible world building anymore because they're just shoving in the pause. They're just shoving in the anti-white crap, the anti-white messaging throughout. What we're looking at is ideological capitalism. These companies are willing to lose money to attack whites. This isn't sort of the banal thing that a lot of people imagine, that companies, they just cave to PC pressure because they think it'll earn them money because they don't want to be perceived as racist. No, there was no PC pressure here. There was no PC pressure to have a black lead in Star Wars or have feminist girl power Mary Poppins Jedis running around in Star Wars. There is no PC pressure for any of that to happen. These companies go out of their way to do this, knowingly lose money to do this, to push an anti-white Starbucks racist agenda. So let's go ahead and take a look at the little conditioning program that Starbucks has put its employees through.
When I go into stores, sometimes I get followed, which is really annoying, and it just gives me, it just makes me uncomfortable, and sometimes I get anxiety, so I have to leave. Especially being a teen of color, they assume that you're doing something bad.
I feel like I'm disturbing people by just being there. people feel uncomfortable when I walk in. I guess I've kind of become numb to it after so many years. Like, this is just my life, and it's just something that I've gotten used to, unfortunately.
I think all of us make that choice at some point of, am I going to take the burden of this interaction being comfortable, or am I going to say, you take the burden of this interaction being comfortable? Because what I really want is a sandwich. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to fight. I'm hungry. Right? I don't want to get into this with you, and I'm really not here to teach you this.
Means that not only do I allow you in, but it means that I'm glad you're here. I want to serve you. I want your business. And I don't draw distinctions between you and other customers in terms of your value. But it's time we talk about what it means to not be welcomed as an American citizen.
It's not like I can mute my actual physical blackness. Right? So I just assume that people see a particular thing when they see the color of my skin. So everything else has to be like perfect and clean and as blended in as possible. It's really just an arsenal of different masks, you know? And it happens every time I leave my house.
When I leave my house, regardless of where I'm going, I'm just leaving my house. Just walking out the door. I'm not walking out the door thinking, what kind of hurdle am I going to run into today? What kind of way am I going to be judged? I walk out a free man. I just do my thing.
I have to make sure that I have given enough space between myself and another patron or another commuter on the train, just ensure that I'm not making someone uncomfortable. I have to make sure that my hands are visible when I walk into certain places so they make sure I'm not stealing. I try to make sure I make eye contact with people who may or may not be security or managerial staff, just to ensure that, you know, I'm not here to hide anything. I watch my tone to make sure that I don't come off as threatening. Just leaving the house some days, you know, sometimes it just keep you at home and just keep you away from everything.
So the video here has a bunch of clips of blacks basically saying that, you know, nobody knows the troubles I feel. The first problem is that anyone can feel any way. The fact that someone feels a certain way just can't have any bearing on how you treat them, because otherwise you will become a slave to crybabies and whiners. The crybabies and whiners will feel ways, and you will be required to respond to their feelings. What Starbucks is telling their employees to do is insane, and it is just going to leave them open to a kind of racial abuse. I feel a certain way, so you have to... That's where this always leads, when you set yourself up as a slave to crybabies and whiners. That said, I don't believe these people actually feel this way. Black people don't actually feel this way, and black people are just saying this in this video because they know it gets them brownie points. Black people, they have lower levels of stress than whites, they have higher self-esteem than whites, they even have higher intellectual self-assessment than whites, which is to say they rate themselves smarter than white people rate themselves. Even though, based on all standardized test scores, IQ tests, SATs, grades, they're worse, they still rate themselves as being smarter than white people rate themselves. They do not feel put upon, and they also have a lower suicide rate. When a white person steps outside of his house, on average, he is more stressed than the average black person is. All this stuff in this video, this is all made up, and black people will say this because they know if they say that they're suffering from racism, they get privileged treatment. They've learned that if they say the magic word racist, they get privileged treatment. And they know that they can push around a certain kind of white person, sort of a Starbucks racist white, by saying white privilege. That's the purpose of this, and that is the purpose of white privilege, black privilege. The purpose of white privilege is to entrench and expand the existing structures of black privilege. And Starbucks, willing to lose money and burn their goodwill and bend over backwards for blacks who want to sit in their stores without buying anything, is but one example of the kind of institutional privilege that blacks have.
Discrimination against African Americans in public spaces has a long history. In the 1960s, black and white students trying to desegregate buses were firebombed. Black patrons were routinely denied service in restaurants and hotels.
I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve here.
And civil rights workers were dragged from lunch counters, spat upon, and beaten.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy.
The right to be respected in public spaces was at the heart of the civil rights movement.
They keep thinking we begging them for something. We ain't begging for nothing. We telling them what is ours right now.
The freedom movement of the 1950s and 60s insisted that the United States live up to its Constitution and allow equal access for all. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, outlawing discrimination in public spaces. But changing the law doesn't always change reality. And being allowed in doesn't always mean being welcomed.
Okay, wait a minute. Lesson time.
Look at how freedom is being defined here. Freedom is being defined as access to whites. When talking about segregation, the first thing you should consider is what is a home. A home is a space where others are excluded. It is the forceful exclusion with deadly force if need be that makes a home a home. If you cannot exclude, if you cannot drop someone who tries to break in and live in what you call your home, then it's not really your home. And so the concept of a home community, an expanded home in which you can keep the door unlocked, where there are public services, a public pool, a public bowling alley, a public school, even the right of residences to put limitations on what kind of people you can sell your house to. These are all characteristics of the expanded home, the hard shell to preserve a soft interior. Remove this shell and the interior must harden and coarsen and atomize. When the right to exclusion is denied, the home is destroyed. When anyone can buy a house in an area just because they have enough money, your motherland has become a prostitute. You have prostituted your land to the highest bidder, and it turns into what you would expect it to turn into. But I'm being far too generous here. Would the United States strive to achieve the dignity of a prostitute who at least demands riches from those who would take her? The United States imports the worst of the worst, Somalis, who she brings in and who take money from her, something that will not change due to their genetics. And white people didn't want this to happen. We've all heard about ghettos, cities full of blacks and that look like Africa, filled with the sons of Africa, and so become as of Africa as their genetic ancestry and the civilizational tendency of that genetic ancestry would predict. Back when there were debates in Detroit and St. Louis about segregation, the white residents wrote in the papers that if you ended segregation, you would destroy the city. And so it has come to pass. What happened to Baltimore and Atlanta is precisely what the segregationists were trying to prevent. They were trying to prevent the Africanization of your cities. Here's the thing to consider. In terms of population representation, the lynch mobs were no more racially biased than the current criminal justice system was in 2010. Once you factor in the larger black proportion of the South, which incidentally is why the statistical portraits of the South tend to say what they say, blacks were less overrepresented in vigilante executions than blacks today are overrepresented in violent crime incarcerations. And in terms of the sentencing time, multiple of blacks and whites for first-time offenses, the South in 1937 had less of a racial disparity than courts across the entire United States did in 1964 and 2009. Now, why is it higher in 2009 than 1964? Well, I believe this is because blacks are increasingly being tried by Asian and Hispanic juries, who are far less sympathetic to them than whites are even quote-unquote Southern racist whites are. Blacks are going to learn just how nice white people were to them, and they'll wish they could have back all those old Southern white racists. Just as a lot of blacks in East Africa are pining for the days of British colonialism, since they were much nicer than the Chinese. As for why black sentences are about 25% longer for first-time offenses, that's a debated subject. There's one paper that shows that when IQ is controlled for, the sentencing gap goes away, and if IQ is a proxy for courtroom behavior, that would suggest that blacks get longer first-time sentences because they behave worse in court. But the point here is that blacks complain. They said that the Southern courts were racist against them, and they probably weren't. At least no more than courts across the entire country today are. They claimed that the vigilante execution squads were biased against blacks, and they probably weren't. Or at least they were no more racially biased in who they hanged or burned alive than the current legal system is in who they incarcerate for violent crimes. In addition, the odds of a black person going to prison relative to a white person was way higher in 2010 than it was between 1930 and 1960. The heart of Jim Crow. They will always say they are oppressed. It will never stop. Even the turbocucks, the people of Starbucks, vanguard of Clown World, these are the people that the blacks attack the most, precisely because they know they can get stuff from them. You don't see blacks going into Appalachia to try to get white people to not be racist because, one, there's no money in Appalachia, so they're not going to get any gibs from them. And two, the whites in Appalachia aren't saps, at least on this stuff. You see where the blacks push for racism thought. It's in shitlib white areas with money. Where there's mush, you push. The name of this hit piece Starbucks made, A Story of Access, is very apt because what this is about is access to whites, access to the white extended home, to destroy the hard outer shell. And the result is that individuals harden, individuals coarsen and atomize, and they withdraw inward. And you end up with the Bugman paradise. There's nothing inherently oppressive about segregation. All countries are segregate from each other. All individual homes are segregate from each other. A fence and a big sign that says "not welcome" is not a violation of your rights and is a requirement for civilization and a home. And frankly, if you're the kind of person who is so greedy and so grabby that you demand access to exclusive white ethnic spaces, well, you're precisely the kind of person that needs to be kept out. The nature of the demands are insane. Whites paid about half of the funding for black schools before Brown versus Board of Education. And as a result, black schools only had about 60% of the funding that white schools had. 50% came from whites, the remaining 10% came from the blacks. And the blacks considered this a great injustice, and they started to demand that whites pay for 100% of their schools. We're oppressed because white people are only paying for half of our school budget. In 1954, they got their way, more funding from Whitey. But even that wasn't enough. The blacks didn't want to have to go to school with other blacks, even if it was equally funded. See, that was oppressive. I mean, certainly, whites don't want to go to school with blacks. Schools today are more racially segregated than they were in 1972. Why would we expect black people to have to go to school with other blacks? How racist are we to try to force blacks to go to school with other blacks? When you look at actually oppressed groups, it's always about the oppressed trying to escape the clutches of the oppressor. Actually, oppressed groups aren't being promoted by the institutions of the society, and they aren't demanding greater proximity within the group that is supposedly oppressing them. They're not navigating the social space differently. They're trying to escape the social space of their oppressor. So when you have all these people saying, oh, I have to navigate a white social space differently, the fact that you choose white spaces is evidence that your group is not oppressed. It's amazing. You have all of these oppressed brown people, let me use the worshipful, sacralizing term, people of color. And by color, I mean the color brown. The people of color brown, they're constantly trying to get into these places, these white spaces and white organizations and white institutions that are oppressing them. Imagine if the Armenians in Turkey had some march in Istanbul demanding to be served by Turkish diners or staged sit-ins in Ankara. They would be killed and the government would look the other way. Or if the Kurds marched into Baghdad and demanded equal funding for their schools, and that the people of Baghdad pay for it because the people of Baghdad had more money, and that this was their right. Equal rights meant that the Baghdadis had to pay for their schools, had to pay for their stuff. Actually oppressed people don't behave this way. In the United States, who's trying to gain access to the other and who's trying to escape the other? Who would rather have an hour commute than live in a neighborhood predominated by the other? Is it called black flight or white flight? For 200 years, the United States allowed whites freedom from blacks and anyone else, the right to create and maintain the extended home, the home community. The founders clearly believed such things to be well within the purview of the Constitution, and they would know since they wrote the thing. Heck, they went well past merely allowing white communities, but allowed laws that prohibited race mixing. And as late as the early 1800s, the state of Oregon legally prohibited blacks. Not prohibiting blacks in certain areas, no. It was illegal for a black person to enter Oregon. And the federal government allowed the state to do this. 200 years of precedent, all overturned in 1965 because of a public opinion change. There was nothing constitutional about this. This was not some well-worn legal argument. And there's nothing moral about this. Just chimp-outs, mobbing, and a media that framed the destruction of the white extended home, the destruction of the white home community, as having something to do with rights. Actually oppressed people don't behave this way. Privileged and coddled people behave this way. Nobody who is actually oppressed has all of the state textbooks telling you how oppressed they are, or lies about lynching in the way that they do. Nobody who is actually discriminated against has all of the institutions telling dumb and unfalsifiable stories about how discriminated against they are, and forcing you to watch films about how discriminated against they are.
Today, discrimination is against the law. It's the people and the systems that support our communities that must follow suit. No one's going to do it for us. What can you do to make our schools, our parks, our stores, our restaurants as welcoming and as inclusive as they can be?
Translation: what are you going to do to make all of white people's stuff brown people's stuff?
What kind of country do we want to live in?
Oh, I know. This kind of country. Not this kind of country, and definitely not this kind of country.
Who do we want to be?
Not any of these potatoes. And at the end here, you have peak narcissism. What is the point of showing all these potato faces? Okay, there you are, you exist, and since you found your way into a Starbucks promo, you're probably a piece of shit. What's the implication here? We are people. We breathe oxygen. I just want to punch every one of these faces, especially the white guy. Get some self-respect, you shit-eating worm tongue. What's the implication of all this? That I'm supposed to like these people? That I'm supposed to see these people as connected to me somehow? These are the kinds of people who want me dead. These are the kinds of people that celebrate white people dying. These are the kinds of people who celebrate white people being subjugated by third worlders socially and politically and losing their material economy to the Chinese. They are not liberal. They are not left-wing. They are racial partisans who have a hatred in their heart toward whites. Say what you want about the British Empire being misguided, but that was about glory and the white man's burden to uplift and Christianize the savages. These people just hate. They just want to destroy. This is Starbucks racism and the real politics of racial privilege. Starbucks didn't make this sign, but this sign is real. When I set out to make this video, I did not intend to make it nearly as biting as it ended up being, but I just kept writing and out it came, and I realized the average person may see this as extremely aggressive. But that's coming from the point of view of these people being a victim or being weak. I don't see them that way. I don't see Hispanics, or in this case with the focus of Starbucks' campaign, black people as being victims, oppressed, or put upon. I see them as the equivalent of a major world power embedded within the United States. I'm not aggressing against the weak, but hitting back against a population which, if they were a country, would have a larger economy than that of France or Britain, that is demanding control over and submission of my people. I know it was a long delay between the last video. I don't plan on making this a new norm. If you like these kind of videos, feel free to donate on Patreon, as that is a per video charge. A video even as lightly edited as this takes anywhere from 12 to 20 hours to make, even more if I have to do original research. And stay tuned for my next video on World War I and historical determinism, and then the upcoming Free Soil series.